Shangwen and Gardner. You'll see their full bios in the program brochure that you have. And we're especially thrilled, I have to say, especially thrilled to have a real live Chinese farmer with us today. Shangwen almost didn't make it here. He got here yesterday from Guangdong, and he will tell you all about himself. And he was an environmental activist and then decided to become an organic farmer in southern China. And he's organized a lot of Chinese farmers to produce organic rice. He'll tell you all about that. But so we're so glad you made it, Shangwen. Thank you all so much for being here, and we're absolutely thrilled. So over to you, Barbara, and again, after this panel, we'll have another 10-minute break.
Thank you so much, Jinda. Can you all hear me? All right. I'm going to start by asking each one of our panelists to introduce themselves, because we really do have a fabulous dynamic group here. Shangwen, would you please introduce yourself first?
Hello everyone. My name is Shangwen. I'm from the southern part of China, called Candong. I'm a foodie and I'm an eco farmer. And our farmer name is rice harmony. In Chinese, it called 天地人, it means you get the harmony from the heaven, the earth, and the human. Thank you.
Hi there. I'm Gardner. I teach at Smith College. Trained as a Chinese historian, but have turned some of my interest to the environment. After 2010, when I went to the NRDC, and Barbara very kindly hosted me and let me trail her group for the better part of a summer, and hence my continued interest today.
Hi everyone, my name is Guo Dong. I work at Columbia's Earth Institute, where I'm a research scholar. And I also teach a course on microeconomics for environmental science and policy for graduate students. We have a lot of environment-related projects in China. For example, we work on sustainability metrics, measuring urban sustainability performances of Chinese cities. We just published a book on sustainable finance. We also work on local environmental governance. Thank you. Very happy to be here.
Thank you all for being here. So let's start with you, Dong. You've been following China's environmental policies for many, many years. Now we see that the government has a tremendous focus on the environment and also has pledged some very aggressive climate policies. What's changed in China and why?
Well, actually, quite a lot has changed. You probably all heard President Trump's been saying, this climate change or global warming is a hoax by the Chinese, right? Actually, not long ago, probably around the 2010, that was the narrative that China used. China was saying at the time that climate change, global warming is this hoax by the US and the West to contain China's growth. At the time, I think in 2009, China was building, probably in the past 5 years, was building like 500 plus coal-fired power plants. It was consuming 40% of the world's coal. To not let them consuming coal or be more clean means that they cannot continue to grow. So that was a big part of it. If you remember the story where Premier Wen Jiabao went to the Copenhagen climate change conference, he was sort of acting the way the Trump administration is acting today in international climate talks, right? He was not really going to that meeting hosted by President Obama. Was viewed as a stunt because he sent a lower level delegation to that meeting. He was on the side hosting a separate meeting with the BRIC countries, basically trying to stay on the line of we can be part of this, but the West has to provide the finance and the technology, right? Because it's sort of industrialized nations that got us to this place. But actually around the same time, all of that was happening. There was a survey done in China in 2012. There were 90% of the Chinese people who believe in climate change. Because if you just look at the air pollution is so palpable, right? It's a big issue in all major cities. So I think it's really that grassroots level understanding that propelled the government to change, adopt a different tack. So then, in 2013 or 2014, when Obama went again to China, they had a deal. He had a deal with President Xi. That sort of paved the way for the Paris Agreement. China sort of changed tack and decided, we sort of have to do this, just out of our domestic interest. So a lot has changed then. So China is sort of like being this leader now in using renewables, solar, wind, hydropower, of course. From sort of calling out the U.S. That climate change is a hoax by the West. So it's almost go complete cycle.
Thank you so much. Dan, the Chinese government is pushing something called ecological civilization. What is that? Tell us about it.
I think to understand it, we have to rewind to 2013 and put this into context. In the early months of 2013, we have now President Xi Jinping assuming power. And I think the calendar here is very important. He assumes power in May of that year, 2013. He convenes the Politburo in a study session and declares that the Communist Party promises a change to an ecological civilization. That is, civilization where economic growth won't come at the expense anymore of the environment. Now let me say this, whether this is happening or not, and I believe it is, this is a tremendous policy change, and I don't think we should doubt that. China, for all of these years, has held to a policy of economic growth first and then clean up the pollution. So it's basically been prioritizing the economy. And in 2013, when he meets with the Politburo, it signals we are making a formal change. So why the change? Well, again, I said the calendar year. In 2013, in January, we have the smog of all smogs blanketing North China, and especially Beijing, the so-called apocalypse, where the air, the pollution, the PM2.5 level was 40 times higher than universal health standards, 40 times higher, where the air over Beijing, according to studies, was worse. The air that people breathe was worse than the air in the average cigarette or smoking lounge in an American airport. So we have the apocalypse. This is in January. In March, so again, he's assumed power. In March, 16,000 pig corpses are found bobbing up and down the Huangpu River by Shanghai. Very public. Now, remember, the Huangpu River is the main drinking source for Shanghai. So this is really quite big news. In May, officials in Guangzhou province, a very affluent province, released their own study saying that 44% of the sample of rice they've taken in the area is cadmium laced with heavy metals. So their staple is killing them in some way. So those events are taking place, and then international studies at this time are circulating that make a real impact in China and the globe. First is the Global Burden of Disease study. It was a study of 2010. It came out in 2013, and what they discovered, this is on the front page of the New York Times. In 2010, 1.2 million Chinese died prematurely simply from breathing the air. And so this made a big impact. But the cost wasn't just health, and this is what President Xi is responding to when he says, we need to establish an ecological civilization. There is the health cost, of course, but there's the cost to the GDP, which is really what drives the party to a great extent. So that was about 3 to 10% You have international reputation, the cost there, and then you have people showing impatience in street protests. So it's in that context that he says, time to move to an ecological civilization where harmony and harmony between man, as he puts it, and the earth and the planet is struck.
Thank you, Dan. Truly a turning point for China. And you mentioned the contamination of rice by toxic chemicals. The Shangwen, you are working on that from the grassroots level. We are all interested in hearing your story of what you are doing and why, and tell us about your organization called Rice Harmony.
Okay, thank you. Actually, at the first stage of my work is on take the sample of the rice, sample of soil to test, to see how it's contaminated by the pesticide, heavy metal. And I think one big change in recent years is the Chinese government willing to publish all the information. And I think the people can understand the environmental issue is really close to their daily life. The food, the water, the air. And go back to myself. and currently what I'm doing in China is I, together with 60 local farmer household to grow organic rice. And we ship this rice to the household in the city. We try to build a bridge between the city and the village. And market power, the consumption power can be some kind of motivation to help the village to turn to be a more ecological friendly place. Because sustainable agriculture is such a big environmental issue in China. So that's currently what I'm doing. I also want to share one small story is why I noticed for agriculture. Because it's about 15 years ago in 2005. I do an investigation for the skin disease of the farmers. Because at that time I'm a commercial consultant. They want to develop a product for the farmer. Then I go 100 village in China to see what's their skin disease and what does it come from. And I noticed quite a lot of that disease is because the consistent contamination with the chemicals. It's actually hard to deal with by medicine unless cut off the pesticide, cut off the fertilizer. So that's the first time I noticed, wow, how the food issue, environmental issue, and public health issue are connected. Yeah, just this.
I'm sure a lot of people in China are new to the issue of organic food. How much interest is there in China in organic food? And how do people know that the food that is labeled organic really is organic? Because we know there's always an issue about labeling in China.
Right, and I think most people, even the farmer, know organic farming, know the term. And most people ever buy and try organic products. But just very, very small portion of people will choose organic product as their daily life, daily food. And that's the situation. And I think most understanding or the conscience about organic rice is coming from the fear about food safety. But I think only the fear cannot build a sustainable movement. And such as what Professor Dong mentioned just now, and I think the people need to understand the relationship between a sustainable development and the agriculture, not just about fear about the safety issues, food safety issues.
Can you tell us about some of the other activists that you've come across, the grassroots activists working on these issues? What motivates them?
At the beginning, I'm a backpacker, and I travel a lot inside China. And then later, I work for Greenpeace as a forest campaigner, mainly for the REDD issues. It is so-called reduced emission from land degradation and deforestation. I'm not sure someone knew every 2-3 log, one will ship to China for usage for manufacture and for exportation. And also people log the wood in Amazon to plant the soybean, and the soybean import into China for raise the pig, raise the chicken. And that's the environmental issue. I think the environmental issue of China is not about China, it's about the world. And the issue is not local, but it's a global environmental issue. I can show another cases about the electrical e-waste. That means like this one. There's a place in China called Guiyu. It's quite close to my hometown in Canton. That's the place for the center for e-waste treatment globally. Most of your mobile phone use will send there for treatment. And the place cause heavy pollution, cause a lot of cancer village at that place. The Chinese government decided to stop that over 10 years ago. But just a few months ago, I met a doctor in that area. She told me that the cancer rate is still rising. That means even you try to tackle the environmental problem, you still need time to tolerate the impact. And I think the scholar told me that it still need maybe 20 years, 30 years to clean up the whole place. That's the work truly happened on the ground.
Lots of work to do. Dong, you have conducted polling on these issues. What do Chinese people think about the environment? Are they interested in climate change? What have you learned?
Well, there were actually, I talked about this earlier, there was actually a survey in 2012, right? There are 90% of people in China who believed in climate change. At the time, I think a similar survey was done in the US. It's about 70% of people believed in climate change. Almost all of the people who believed in climate change in China think that they were affected by it. So there's huge impact on their lives. Much smaller proportion of people here in the States thought they could be affected by climate change. So I think it's that difference that really made China or the governments to act on fight for climate change so aggressively. We did a survey in Henan province, that's where I came from, in 2015, I think, in 3 cities in Henan. We asked about 3,000 people, what's the most important sustainability issues on their mind for their city. The number one issue was air pollution. So people really identify with that, again, because that's so palpable. Everyone feels the impact of bad air quality. They also say they care about inequality, income inequality, access to education, access to healthcare. So those are the things that's very important to them as well. They talk about corruption because there's such a big corruption campaign in China for the past few years, and that again starts feeding into the inequality narrative, right? So I think people care about a range of systemic issues, air quality being the most significant, as Shangwen mentioned earlier. But if you looked at the US, for example, I think generally people have a better understanding of sustainability. Over there, I think people talk about the environment because they feel the impact through air pollution, water pollution. But if you talk about biodiversity, which scientifically is a very important indicator, but most people doesn't think that's so important because it's more far-fetched from their everyday life, right? So I think there's a sort of a difference in understanding, between China and probably in the U.S. That's why in China, you still have, governments on leading the way, but here in the U.S., it's more powered by the public. We just had a climate strike yesterday by the students, right? And then, the private sector sort of have to respond to that by, coming up with more durable goods, more sustainable goods, and have to, look after their supply chain companies, make sure that those are sustainable. But in China, you really have the government sort of leading the way, setting very ambitious targets, and meeting them, surprisingly. I think people really care about these issues, but I think it's really because what they experience in their everyday lives, rather than really understanding the nuances of what sustainability is all about. I think that still has to improve.
Yes, please.
Can I add to that, please? I think we know the difference between China in 2009 in Copenhagen, not terribly cooperative by all counts, and then China in 2015 at Paris, where they promoted, it seems to be, the climate agreement pretty strongly. There was a change. And I think the change is not so much the attitude about climate. So I'm underscoring something that I think Dongbo said. The concern is environmental pollution. That's what's motivated government policy. And he listed some of the changes that have gone on, and certainly many since 2013, associated with ecological civilization. Those policies are meant to address the pollution problem for reasons I've suggested, but also because the people have been not terribly happy with the environmental situation. 2015, they go to Paris. In 2014, of course, she meets with Obama, and there's realization that likely what's going to benefit the climate is going to benefit the environment, environmental pollution. And so the way I read it right now is the investment in climate change, it's real in China, but it's a co-beneficiary, as I would put it, of their concern with environmental pollution, which is very deep, and I think is for them the motivating factor.
Thank you. Would you like to add to that?
Yeah, maybe I can add a story. I was talking with the local official because I work very close in the village. I asked them, do you ever hear about climate change? No. But do you hear about environment protection? Yes. I think that's what the top down to the bottom. And the real motivation for the change happening in China.
Yeah, I would also say for me it was counterintuitive when I was talking to somebody who used to help run Oxfam in China. She said, and Godong probably knows this survey, Oxfam took a survey in I think 2011, 2012, asking especially rural people if they were aware of climate change. What was interesting, she pointed out to me, is that it's the rural Chinese are much more aware of climate change because they're living it. They see it in agriculture, they see it day to day, and they're much more conscious of it than people in urban areas where we might expect to see, or at least, now again, this is a number of years ago, but the early concern with climate change was driven by rural China, at least according to this Oxfam survey.
Shangwen, now you're leading a movement here to produce organic rice and other food. What do the people in the cities feel about organic food? Do they care about it? Are they willing to pay more for it?
And I think that really a small portion of people care about food safety, not necessarily care about organic labeling, because quite a lot of fake product in the market, and people don't trust the third party certification, and people more trust the people they can know the farm, they can see, and I think maybe one tradition for the Chinese that if you just go up one generation or two generation, for example, my grandfather is farmers. I think most people, if you go up, they are farmers, just about 30 or 40 years. So they actually have connection with the local farming. I think that's one of the key believing behind the newer organic farming for them.
Well, I think you're doing a lot right today by being here in front of us so people can see a real organic farmer. And I hope they can all go back to their families, if any, in China and tell them about this. And it seems like there's a huge role for you as being a spokesman for this movement to travel around the country and help educate people that it's real and that it makes a difference. So I'll open this next question up to any of you, all of you. Given this interest in environment, what are the biggest challenges that China faces in environmental protection?
I can start. Well, there's a lot of problems, obviously. I think one of the biggest challenges we as a research team identified, not just for China, for sustainability in general, is a lack of measurement. Like when in China we used to talk about GDP numbers, right? So the GDP performances are tied to official promotion, tied to annual evaluations. So that's really the single most important indicator. Now, if we want to transition to sustainability, to environmental protection, what are the relevant metrics? Right? There's a time when the mayor of Beijing publicly said, "My job is on the line if I don't, clean up the air." He publicly said that Beijing is unlivable. To have that type of thing coming out of a politician's mouth in China is very rare. But he's openly admitting we have a big problem. We have to, deal with it. But what do we have in terms of the metrics, the measurements, to hold the politicians, the decision makers accountable to their words? So that, I think, is lacking. We have the Peter Drucker, who's a guru of management, once said, "You cannot manage if you cannot measure." Right? So unless we have meaningful, quantifiable measurements, metrics, indicators for sustainability, for environmental protection, for social issues that we have in a lot of the mega cities, we cannot really meaningfully achieve sustainability. So that's why, as a group, we sort of developed a framework with 22 indicators in 5 broad categories that included economics, included social issues, and 3 categories on the environment: environmental resources, pollution, environmental emissions, waste, and environmental governance. 22 indicators to measure the sustainability performances of Chinese cities. We rank, 100 medium-sized and above cities in China on their sustainability performances. We've done that for a few years now, and I think the ranking, people like to look at rankings, just like the university rankings that we have here, to hold the government accountable. They'd be interested in where their cities is. If they don't perform well, they'll probably go to the politicians and demand an answer. So hopefully that'll push the decision makers at the city level to adopt certain indicators that will help them guide their decision-making process and hopefully push the process towards sustainability. And just very quickly, I think there's another well, I can maybe later.
Yeah, we're just running out of time. Dan, very quickly.
As quickly as you'll cut me off. I would say 3 major challenges. One is what Dongguo referred to, and that is the economic imperative that the government feels. I mean, it has a long-standing bargain with the people. You accept one-party rule, will guide you to economic prosperity. Now, what that means is they're shuttering coal mines now, but they open them up when the economy weakens so that they stimulate the heavy industry to keep unemployment lower and to keep the people happy. So that's one. Two, massive urbanization. I think you all know they're talking about moving 300 million rural inhabitants to the cities by 2025. Think about what that means for the environment. And yet they're doing it even as they talk about developing an ecological civilization. Why? Because they say urbanization is essential to transitioning the economy. That if we're going to move away from heavy manufacturing, export-driven economy to one of high-tech services based on domestic consumption, we have to develop the urban population. And then the third is related to that, the growing middle class. Their spending, which of course is just what the government wants them to do. At what environmental cost? This is what the government is going to have to figure out.
Okay, thank you. Shangwen.
From the grassroots perspective, I think there's two. One is the consumptionism. If the middle class, the rich people think bigger is better, more is better, fast consume, fast buy, fast consume, fast drop out, that will be a big problem for the environmental protection. And another big challenge is the unemployment issue, because China seems no longer be the global factory. Actually, in the village, in recent just 1 or 2 years, I see a lot of people lost their job and come back to the village. That's quite a serious problem. It will affect how the government choose the economic development model.
We just have a couple more minutes, so I want to ask each of you to give me your top solution for how China can address these difficult problems of environmental protection.
Well, I don't have the magic wand here. Well, I guess, for me, I think, as Shangwen said, this environmental issue, the causes can be local. I think a lot of the issues that come from where people are concentrated, where people live. But sustainability is essentially global, right? So I think, as the Trump administration sort of left the door open for international leadership on the climate front, I think China has really to step up. Earlier, Dan mentioned, the opening of the coal-fired power plants. China's been closing thousands of coal-fired plants domestically. But internationally, if you look at African countries, the countries along the Belt and Road Initiative, there's a lot of new coal-fired power plants being built. They all have, Chinese footprints behind them. They can be financed by China or have Chinese expertise. So that's not leading by example, right? So you're shutting down the domestic power plants, but then you're building new ones, elsewhere in the world. As we said, this sustainability is a global issue. So I think they have to step up to really lead the way. But in terms of application, in terms of the production of renewables, hydropower, wind power, solar power, China's all been leading. But in terms of having this vision, having the know-how of forming an international coalition to really combat climate change, I think there's some room for China to improve on.
I have my pie in the sky ambitions for China. The pie in the sky ambitions, but they're meaningless. They're just things that I'd like to see China do. But what practically China can do, I think the one thing I would want China to do is, and again, echoing Dong Guo here a bit, is hold local officials accountable to the national agenda. There is a national agenda, and they're articulating it further and further each day, but the local officials have their own agendas, so that coal-fired power plants, even as the government's shuttering them one place, they're being opened up in another because they're good for the local economy. The government has to impose its rules and has to impose its fines on those who violate environmental standards.
And I don't think there's a single solution for that. If that have that will be patient. I think the problem is so big, we just need time. And also, we need to go back to the grassroots level, go back to the community. If we think about the first 10 or 20 years, is quite a radical movement, environmental movement in China. The government actually put a lot of effort and enlightened for protection. But what else? What else people in China? Can they more engage or participate in the movement? And I think that will be the last stage.
These issues are complex ones, and I put you on the spot by asking you what your top solution would be when they're so complex. So I believe everyone on our panel, as our time is running out, has agreed to stick around a little while longer if you have questions or like to talk with them more. And if you're really interested and like to learn more about these issues, I know our professors here have published quite a bit recently, books and articles that they can tell you about. And finally, I'm just delighted to the China Institute, which launched my book tour, Will China Save the Planet, has some for sale here, right in the back. Very short, but sweet. So I urge you to take a look. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for what an amazing, amazing panel. Guodong, you're an incredible expert. Dan, your transition to studying the ecology and environment is fascinating. And thank you so much for sharing that. Shangwen, absolutely amazing for us to hear from someone who's actually fighting the fight at the grassroots level and really doing the work. And again, I will say, Barbara is really an incredible expert on China's environment. She knows it more better than just about anybody. And this book is an amazing book. She's kind of at the cutting edge. The title is Will China Save the Planet? So it's really looking at how the ways in which China is taking leadership on these issues, facing lots of difficulties, but taking leadership. So thank you all so much. Please talk to all of them. You have a chance. Again, we're going to take a 10-minute break, and then we're going to come back. We've talked about food and the environment, and next we're going to talk about food and art. So stick around. We'll come back in 10 more minutes.